Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In the Middle East, as presumably almost anywhere else, nothing succeeds like success. Also, values are a very limited value. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad managed to survive a very difficult several years of civil war in which he practically converted a lot of his nominal sovereignty to a free hand for his sponsors from Russia, Iran, and the Lebanese Hezbollah. Regardless of the price he has paid, Assad is still standing and has now been grudgingly accepted back into the fold of Arab rulers from Egypt to Saudi Arabia and Jordan to the Gulf. How is the regional system going to be realigned based on this new reality? And will Washington, which is trying to balance conflicting interests and policies in and around Syria, accept this new reality, though it deviates from its declared wishes? To analyze it, we're joined all the way from Washington, D.C. by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Thank you for joining us, General.
Sure.
Also joining us from London, the UK, is retired Colonel Dr. Joel Rayburn, who is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary and Special Envoy for Syria. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
My pleasure.
And with me in the studio, as always, is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so many other productions, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding or maybe a framework for the discussion points we're going to touch on today.
So none of the Arab rulers in the Middle East, and obviously nor the Iranians, are candidates for any human rights award. So for them, the problem with Bashar Assad has not been the evil treatment of his own population. When some segments took arms against him when the Arab Spring started a dozen years ago. But Assad looked weak and was probably about to fall until 2015, when both ISIS was riding high and the Russians intervened in Syria to help their protege or client, Assad. So having survived these dozen years, the Arab rulers have looked at it realistically by way of realpolitik and decided to go with the winner. This is part of the realignment of the entire area when the U.S. is perceived as being or turning away from the region, the so-called pivot to the east. Now, of course, you will hear from Washington that it is not necessarily so. There are remnants of presence and so on and so forth. And there's an overwatch should ISIS be resurgent. But nevertheless, everyone here knows that the trend is with the Chinese, perhaps also with the Russians, and away from the United States. So the Arab leaders, even though many of them, such as the Egyptian Abdel Fattah al-Sisi or the Jordanian King Abdullah II, they are firmly in the American or Western orbit. But nevertheless, they have reconsidered and are now working with Assad, and Israel should reconsider the situation too, because Assad had a sort of practical immunity from Israel because he was seen as the lesser evil. But if he turns against Israel now that he feels overconfident, the Israeli view may also change.
Not necessarily the lesser evil, but the known evil, which is something that can be dealt with. General Kimmitt, we'll start with you. How do you regard currently the state of play vis-a-vis Syria?
Well, I think Emil gave a pretty good laydown. May have neglected to talk about the role where Turkey plays in all this as well. Turkey obviously is holding a significant and the largest number of Syrian refugees Erdogan has just been reelected. One of his campaign promises, in fact, both the candidates' campaign promises, was to start moving those Syrian refugees back in. And if Assad agrees with that, and they can come to some sort of condominium in that regard, you recognize at that point that practical realpolitik is starting to overwhelm Assad's record over the last 15 years of slaughter. I think at this point, the only country that is not embracing this notion of realpolitik may well be the United States.
Right. The United States State Department has been quite vocal about condemning any normalization with the Assad regime. And I'd like to ask you, Dr. Rayburn, as somebody who's closely also dealt with Syria, as has, of course, General Kimmitt, but dealing with the Syrian file for quite some time, how do you look at the current development where the United States is the only one, basically, who has still sway over this region that is unwilling to see the Assad regime normalize its relations with any country in the region?
Well, actually, I don't think that's accurate. The entire European bloc remains, it's politically isolated from the Assad regime, or the Assad regime is politically isolated from it. So the United States is not alone here. I would say I would take issue. Here's where I would disagree with Emil. What we're in is a period of unrealpolitik in the Arab capitals, because normalization simply cannot work. We know it can't work because it's been tried before repeatedly, not just with Bashar al-Assad, but with his father's regime as well. The nature of that regime doesn't change. This normalization outreach from the Arab capitals to Damascus is a movie that we've sat through before, and we know where the ending is. The ending is that Assad doesn't fulfill any of his commitments. He just continues to facilitate the IRGC and Hezbollah, creating a bigger and bigger military threat against Israel, against Jordan, and so on Israel's northern border. And the whole thing will collapse of its own weight at a certain point. And that'll particularly be true if the United States doesn't revoke its Caesar sanctions, because that prevents any Gulf country from having illicit economic relations with Damascus. And that's all that Assad wants out of that relationship, really. With some political legitimacy, I think he believes he gets, but he's already pocketed that. So the only thing that's left for him is the money. And the money from the Gulf can only come to him now under the table. And that's not enough to stabilize him. I mean, the last thing is, and General Kimmitt's absolutely right, Turkey is a big factor in all of this. And to be honest with you, Turkey's interests in Syria are incompatible with those of the Assad regimes. Those refugees are not going back while the Assad regime can touch them, and we're just sort of in a stalemate along those lines. So I don't think there's going to be an Ankara-Damascus normalization anytime soon.
Now, Joel just mentioned the term stability, and when you listen to the various declarations of the Biden administration spokespeople, they are involved in contradictions because they want stability in the region, but they are also willing for that stability to be bought at a price. They had the same reaction to the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement under Chinese auspices. Yes, they have blessed the stability that this will bring, even though they didn't like the Chinese auspices. Now, this is the stability that you usually see at cemeteries. If you look at Syria, of course, if you want to get stability and the peace and quiet of cemetery, Assad is your best bet.
Indeed. Well, just to interject about what Dr. Rayburn noted earlier, I agree that Europeans are indeed backing the United States in the Caesar Act against the Assad regime, but I don't see any of them acting against any of the Gulf nations, bringing the Assad regime back into the fold at this stage. And I did used two words in my statement saying hold sway over the Middle East, which is the emphasis. The United States still holds sway over the Middle East, while the European partners, except for some economic investments in the region, are not as heavily invested and capable of shifting or moving the sands over when we're talking about Middle Eastern policy. General Kimmon, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, since to what degree do you see the interests of the Sunni camp, if you will, the GCC or the Gulf Cooperation Council, actually align itself with bringing the Assad regime into the fold, considering the close relations Assad has both with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and regardless of any rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, there is any love lost in that relationship, nor is there any keen interest on further bolstering relations beyond the current capacities with Moscow.
Yeah, I think that it is a remarkable event. This is the man that 10 years ago called the Arab leaders half men. There is no love lost between, as you would say, the Sunni camp and Bashar al-Assad. So I think you've really got to consider the motivations in the first place, why they're reaching out, and was this done at their urging or the urging of China? It may simply be a realization by the Gulf bloc that or as the old saying goes, keep your enemy close, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. It simply may be a matter that the Gulf countries believe that these issues that Joel brought out, which is over 40 years of Iranian support for Hezbollah, 40 years of support for the Damascus regime, has got to come to an end. And it perhaps may be that they believe the best way is by grabbing Assad and bringing him closer. But I agree with Joel as well that this has been tried before. But I also think it's important to note that America had full relations with Syria before the civil war started, at a time where we had a great concern with Iranian influence inside of Syria. So this is nothing new. The United States has dealt with Syria when it was getting $30 billion a year from Tehran before the civil war. That's when Syria also enjoyed full diplomatic relations with their Gulf partners. So it may just simply be that everybody is saying the civil war has been horrible. It has been terrible on the people of Syria, but it is a fact that sanctions have not worked. Putting him outside of the GCC has not worked. We're starting to make rapprochement with Iran, so we might as well do it with Assad as well. There is, in fact, what I would consider diplomatic fatigue on this issue that has gone on for too long, and maybe it's the time to resolve that diplomatic fatigue.
Were sanctions ineffective, or were they not properly enforced, for that matter? Dr. Rayburn?
Well, I mean, in my experience, they weren't enforced. We only, our maximum pressure window, if you will, lasted only 6 months under the Caesar Act. We implemented the Caesar Act in June 2020, and the last major tranche of sanctions that we did under those authorities was December 2020, and then the new administration came in the following month and halted the sanctions process while they did what they call the policy review. So no, I think economic pressure just wasn't tried. The isolation policy just wasn't that sustained, unfortunately. I wish it had been otherwise. And there's still an opportunity to go back to that at any time. You can flip the switch and go back into sanctions enforcement. It's not rocket science. But I mean, General Kimmon's 100% right about the motivations of the Arab capitals right now. I think the normalization outreach to Assad is a byproduct of the Beijing deal. I suspect it's a quid pro quo that the Saudis committed to in exchange for the Chinese guaranteeing Iranian influence to get the Houthis to go back into the ceasefire process in Yemen. And in that regard, we'll have to wait and see. I suspect the Saudis are not that deeply committed to this policy. And at such time when the whole thing it collapses, because Hezbollah is not going to be restrained, the IRGC is not going to be restrained, and frankly, I don't think the Houthis are going to be restrained in Yemen either. Then I think this approach will collapse of its own weight. It's just there will have been an opportunity cost because we could have been working on a coherent policy in the meantime. Although I have to concede, I understand the frustration of the Arab capitals because they're doing what they're doing, and they're going back to an experiment that failed multiple times before because, frankly, they got frustrated with the lack of U.S. leadership on the issue, which spans several presidential administrations. The Biden administration is guilty, but they're not the only ones. And so I understand the frustration. I just think it's unfortunate that the Arab capitals now are veering off down a side street that's going to lead into the same cul-de-sac that they went down after the Rafiq Hariri assassination, when isolation against Assad and opprobrium against Assad, began to crumble. And then there was the embrace at the Annapolis conference, and then with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, which all wound up crashing and burning. And I predict there will be no difference this time.
General Kimmitt, just a couple of weeks ago, when the Middle East Institute hosted the U.S. Undersecretary for Policy and Strategy, Dr. Kaelin, you asked her about particularly the investment or the fact that while DoD, the Defense Department, is very much involved in the Middle East, you don't see as much interagency involvement, including from State Department and other angles of U.S. government. Is this an indication that the United States is not truly interested in getting involved in the Middle East?
Well, it's been a long-standing problem, and Joel has served in the region. I've served in the region, and we see the capabilities that the Department of Defense brings to diplomacy in that region. The mill-to-mill relationships with the country is very strong. The ability to do persistent engagement with the military is very, very strong. But unfortunately, when you have that as your effective policy, that the Middle East policy will be run by the Pentagon, when the Pentagon then says we're pivoting to Asia, that's a very, very distinct message that is being sent to the Middle East. And what I was suggesting in that question is, if we could have diplomacy take the lead in that region, the way that President Biden said our national security would be led by the diplomats, we might have a better outcome as the military transitions from the Gulf to the Far East, something that I don't think we're doing, but that is certainly the perception among all the capitals. One point I would make as a sidebar, we talk about the policies that haven't worked very well. The United States has had some pretty interesting policies with Syria over the years. I'm old enough to remember when we fought side by side with Syrian troops attacking Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. So we have demonstrated quite a bit of flexibility that we were actually in combat together with Syrian troops at one time. And then we were having Obama threatening bombing strikes into Syria another time. Now, certainly different people in charge between Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. Bashar is an apple that fell too far from the tree, but Syria is Syria, and their policies have been consistent for the past since the Iranian Revolution. It just seems that American and Western policies have changed significantly, and now we're seeing the Gulf policies change as well.
Well, of course, I noted in my introduction to today's program that the Assad regime has pretty much forfeited his own sovereignty by allowing Russia and Iran to enter into his theater and basically take the leading role in dictating basically Damascus's foreign policy, at least from Moscow's perspective, which changes, of course, the whole perspective of U.S. policy, especially also during the Obama administration. Leading from behind, I don't think that is necessarily the way you want to go about things here in the region, but that's for a different program altogether. The executive branch, yes, sir.
Yeah, Jonathan, I would just ask a question. How, in fact, do you believe that the Syrian policy has changed over the last 30 years?
It's pretty much has been forced into changing its policies. Maybe its policies have not changed, but the fact of the matter is that Moscow and Tehran have their own interests at heart, while Damascus, even though it does seem to have its own keen policy for specifics, it does owe a gratitude of debt, and not just gratitude in that debt, to both the Ayatollah regime and the Kremlin in this matter. And therefore, go ahead.
Well, may I humbly interject with a wild theory? Americans love lines on the map, perhaps starting with the Mason-Dixon line. The 38th parallel in Korea, the 17th in Vietnam. And right now, what you have in Syria is west of Euphrates, or the valley, and east of the river. East of the river is the main priority of CENTCOM in Syria. Of course, Syria itself is only second priority to the Gulf or to the sea lines of communications. West of the Euphrates is a Russian domain. There is a deconflicting mechanism, but nevertheless, it is obvious that the Russians, because they want their naval bases and their Air Force base at Khmeimim, and they want to guard the Assad regime, they have been given almost a free hand to do what they want between the Mediterranean and the river, while the US concentrates on the other side. Is that a simplistic approach, Mark?
Well, I would sort of look at it. First of all, I agree with you, but the point that I would make is that the introduction of China into the situation, along with Russia, I don't think are necessarily situations that have caused Assad to change his policies. In fact, one of the reasons they're in there is because they're able to amplify Assad's policies. They've been able to keep him in power, and they've been able to allow him to continue his policy of fighting the civil war, allowing the IRGC to maintain a presence inside there, and maintaining Iranian influence. So it must be considered that what the West has on offer is completely different from what China and Russia have on offer, and now what the Gulf states have on offer. All of these allow Assad to stay in power when the West is trying to change his regime and hence change him from being in power.
Dr. Rayburn, I'd like to hear your position on this as well. And of course, if you may also highlight the fact that while the Biden administration is lagging behind and is not necessarily very successful in its current relations with the GCC, with the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia in particular, it seems that Congress is taking the beat on here and is trying to make a change with regard to U.S. foreign policy, particularly for the Middle East.
Well, I think it's not that Congress is trying to dictate a change in policy. Congress is doubling down on its own preferred Syria approach, which is the pressure approach that was encapsulated in the Caesar Act that was signed into law in 2019. I think there's been frustration in Congress over the lack of enforcement of the Caesar Act, and then there's been the normalization moves that really accelerated after the February earthquake. I think prompted the recent congressional action, which is to essentially do the anti-normalization bill that the House Foreign Affairs Committee has passed is essentially like a Caesar 2.0. It doubles down on the sanctions. It extends them, closes some loopholes, it extends scrutiny to the diversion of international aid into the Assad regime. And if it passes Congress, if it passes the Senate as well, it'll pass the House, but easily. But if it passes the Senate as well, it will obviate any economic normalization between the Gulf and the Assad regime. And then there'll be a strategic stalemate. And then we'll have to see what happens. It looks to me like Assad and his patrons at that stage, they're kind of out of juice. We'll have to hunker down for a frozen conflict and for other alternatives at resolving it.
General Kimmett, you have roughly 1 minute to respond.
Well, I simply think that the Biden administration needs to consider whether they're going to sign that document or not. Look, the issue with Syria is always considered in the light of the Iranian negotiations, nuclear negotiations. This will not help if the president signs this. This will not help with our relationship with our Arab allies when they're trying to reach out and we're trying to pull back. So I think there's an issue here between congressional intent and foreign policy intent of the president. So it will be interesting to see what happens if that bill passes Congress. Will the president sign it?
Dr. Rayburn?
Well, I don't think any U.S. president is going to veto a sanctions bill against Bashar al-Assad. But General Kimmett's right. The Congress, this vector from Congress, will collide with the Biden administration's quiet preference to reconstruct the JCPOA with the Iranian regime. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
The two mainstays of the Assad regime are obviously the Russians and the Iranians, but they may have divergent views on whether to let Hezbollah escalate its tensions vis-a-vis Israel. The Russians will be against it. The Iranians, we don't know yet. So this is one area to focus on in the next few months.
Well, I've been fascinated during this discussion. Of course, there's much more to talk about, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank General Mark Kimmett, Dr. Joel Rayburn, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel as well. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until next time, shalom from us here in Jerusalem. Israel has launched operations
on Vladimir Putin.
helping Iran develop. We have logic, we have rationale, we understand how the system operates.